Welcome to a meeting of the Hunterdon Central Regional High School Board of Education. Please be advised that this and all meetings of the board are open to the public and media, consistent with the Open Public Meetings Act, and that advance notice required therein has been provided. Meeting notice was also posted in the boardroom of the upper school campus, sent to the Courier News, Star Ledger, Express Times, and the Hunterdon County Democrat, and sent to the clerks of Delaware Township, East Amwell Township, Flemington Borough, Raritan Township, and Reddington Township. The public will have an opportunity to be heard as shown on the agenda. May we rise for the flag salute, please?
Pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Dr. Moore, would you read the mission statement for us, please?
Thank you, absolutely. Proud to. Hunterdon Central is an innovative educational community dedicated to the intellectual, social, and emotional safety and growth of all students. While fostering curiosity and promoting wellness, we aspire to create powerful learning experiences, establish strong partnerships, and serve as contributing members of society.
Thank you. Any correspondence that has been received by the Board of Education is on file in the business office. At this time, I'd like to administer the oath of office for newly elected members, Ms. Gong, Mrs. Kellogg, and Mrs. Santangelo. Would you please rise so I can, or step out front? And somewhere I will find my oath.
You're good. You're
Sure,
good.
you're, oh, absolutely. I just need to find my oath of office.
Is it anywhere here?
Yeah, it's fine.
No. Do you have an extra? As long as you repeat after me, you don't. Can I have your sheet? I have it.
I just looked in here.
I did have it. Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah, it's a big,
Because it's a big thing. You're facing Heather.
there should be one in your package, Dave.
Here we go. Got it.
What I handed you.
I apologize.
This is why he's just meeting.
Oh, he's right there.
I have it.
Oh, yeah.
I'm so sorry.
Them all together.
I remember reading along.
We're good.
So if you can raise your hand and repeat after me, please.
Heather, for the photographer, you should probably put them to the center.
Would you like a Bible? We have one. Okay. So I state your name, please. Do solemnly swear that I will support the Constitution of the United States.
Do solemnly swear that I will support the Constitution of the United States
And the Constitution of the State of New Jersey.
and the Constitution of the State of New Jersey,
And that I will bear true faith and allegiance to the same.
and I will bear true faith and allegiance to the same,
And to the governments established in the United States and this state.
and governments established in the United States and this state,
Under the authority of the people, so help me God.
under the authority of the people, so help me God.
I state your name.
I, Dorothy Keller,
Do solemnly swear that I possess the qualifications of membership prescribed by law,
do solemnly swear that I possess the qualifications of membership prescribed by law,
including specifically that I am not disqualified as a voter pursuant, I'm going to read that,
including specifically that I am not disqualified as a voter pursuant to
RS 19-4-1,
RS 19-4-1,
as well as I am not disqualified due to a conviction of a crime or offense listed
as well as I am not disqualified due to a conviction of a crime or offense, or an offense listed, sorry,
in NJSA 18A 12-1.
in NJSA 18A 12-1.
I state your name.
I, Sandra,
do solemnly swear that I possess the qualifications prescribed by law for this office,
do solemnly swear that I possess the qualifications prescribed by law for the office
of member of Board of Education, and that I will faithfully,
member of the Board of Education, and I will faithfully,
impartially, and justly perform all duties
impartially, and justly perform all duties
of that office according to the best of my ability.
of that office according to the best of my abilities.
So help me God.
So help me God.
Congratulations. Thank you.
Thank you.
It's a third paragraph they added.
So roll call.
I'm going to roll call who's present, please. Mrs. Blutfield?
Here.
Mrs. Duggan? Here. Mr. Fowler?
Here.
Ms. Gong?
Here.
Mrs. Kellogg? Here. Mrs. O'Donnell?
Here.
Ms. Peterson?
Here.
Mr. Reimer?
Here.
And Mrs. Santangelo? Thank you. At this time, I would like to open the floor for nominations for president for the Board of Education. Do I have any nominations, please?
I would like to nominate Mr. Fowler, please.
I would like to nominate Ms. Bledsoe.
I would like to second Ms. Bloodfield, particularly because of the experience that you have and that we are about to do a superintendent search, and you have done that before, so that's why.
Thank you. Any others?
I don't believe that the second is necessary.
We don't
Just
need a
wanna make
second.
sure.
That's
Okay.
absolutely correct. So if you would please, you've been handed ballots for president. If you would please write your choice, either Mr. Fowler or Mrs. Blutfeld, and sign it, and I will collect it and read into the record the results. Thank you. These are in no particular order, so I apologize. It's just how I opened them. Mrs. Duggan, Kane Fowler, Mrs. Santangelo, Kane Fowler, Mr. Fowler, Mr. Fowler, Mrs. Peterson, Mr. Fowler, and Mr. Reimer, Mr. Fowler, Mrs. Gong, Mrs. Blutfield, Mrs. O'Donnell, Mrs. Blutfield, Mrs. Kellogg, Mrs. Blutfield, and Mrs. Blutfield's Mrs. Blutfield. Five to four, Mr. Fowler is elected president. Congratulations. Thank you.
So with that, I believe I can open up for any nominations for vice president.
I continue to do the vice president nominations.
You're
Thank
more
you.
than welcome to. You can do the rest of the agenda. I'm happy to.
It's an 0152. So I'd like to open the floor for nominations for vice president, please.
I'll nominate Mrs. Kellogg.
I would like to nominate Sue Duggan.
Are there any others? If you would please use your vice president ballot and write who your selection is and sign it, we will collect it and read it into the record. Thank you. Mrs. Gong, Mrs. Kellogg, Mrs. O'Donnell, Mrs. Kellogg, Mrs. Duggan, Mrs. Duggan, Mrs. Peterson, Mrs. Duggan, Mrs. Santangelo, Mrs. Duggan, Mr. Fowler, Mrs. Duggan, Mrs. Kellogg, Mrs. Kellogg, Mr. Reimer, Mrs. Duggan. Sorry. And Mrs. Blutfeld, Mrs. Kellogg. 5-4, Mrs. Duggan is elected as board vice president. Congratulations. Thank you. At this time, if you want to play musical chairs, feel free to do so, and I will.
Switch Ms. Gong and Mr. Fowler.
Exactly. And I promise there'll be the same number of seats to sit on when you come and sit. We won't remove any. And Mr. Fowler, would you please read the Code of Ethics as well? At this time, the board president will preside over the meeting. Congratulations, Mr. Fowler.
Thank you, Ms. Spitzer. All right. So, Code of Ethics. Let's hope I don't need that. Going to make a motion, so be it resolved that the New Jersey School Boards Association Code of Ethics shall be considered the official Code of Ethics of the Hunterdon County Regional High School Board of Education. Under the Code of Ethics, number 1, I will uphold and enforce all laws, state board rules and regulations, and court orders pertaining to schools. Desired changes should be brought about only through legal and ethical procedures. Number 2, I will make decisions in terms of the educational welfare of children and will seek to develop and maintain public schools which meet the individual needs of all children, regardless of their ability, race, creed, sex, or social standing. Number 3, I will confine my board actions to policy making, planning, and appraisal, and I will help to frame policies and plans only after the board has consulted those who will be affected by them. Number 4, I will carry out my responsibility not to administer the schools, but together with my fellow board members to see that they are well run. Number 5, I will recognize that authority rests with the Board of Education and will make no personal promises nor take any private action which may compromise the board. Number 6, I will refuse to surrender my independent judgment to special interest or partisan political groups or to use the schools for personal gain or for the gain of friends. Number 7, I will hold confidential all matters pertaining to the school which, if disclosed, would necessarily injure individuals or the schools. But in all other matters, I will provide accurate information and, in concert with my fellow board members, interpret to the staff the aspirations of the community for its schools. Number 8, I will vote to appoint the best qualified personnel available after consideration of the recommendation of the Chief Administrative Officer. Number 9, I will support and protect school personnel in proper performance of their duties. And number 10, I will refer all complaints to the Chief Administrative Officer and will act on such complaints at public meetings only after failure of an administrative solution. Is there anybody who would like to move this motion?
Move this motion into, I've completely lost my train of thought. Thank you. So moved.
So moved.
A second?
Second.
Okay, roll call, please.
Mrs. Blatfield?
Yes.
Mrs. Duggan?
Yes.
Mr. Fowler?
Yes.
Ms. Gong?
Yes.
Mrs. Kellogg?
Yes.
Mrs. O'Donnell?
Yes.
Mrs. Peterson?
Yes.
Mr. Reimer?
Yes.
And Mrs. Santangelo?
Yes.
All yes, motion carries.
All right. Next, I'd like to move to readopt all existing bylaws and policies. Anyone have a motion for that?
So moved.
Second?
Second.
Can I have a roll call for that, please?
Mrs. Blatfield?
Yes.
Mrs. Duggan?
Yes.
Mr. Fowler?
Yes.
Ms. Gong?
Yes.
Mrs. Kellogg? Yes. Mrs. O'Donnell?
Yes.
Mrs. Peterson?
Yes.
Mr. Reimer?
Yes.
And Mrs. Santangelo?
Yes.
All yes, motion carries.
Thank you. Next, we will do a motion to move to reestablish existing board standing committees and ad hoc committees pursuant to policy 0155. I have a motion for that, please.
I actually
We
would like
need
to
to have
also
the
make a
members, please.
motion to establish a policy committee this year. I think our policy manual is in need of some attention and a bit outdated in places and could use a focused committee to address that.
Okay, there's a motion to,
So,
yeah,
I think if you.
Because we have two different sections here.
reestablish existing,
yep.
and then take, under additional board business perhaps, or at some other point, a motion to
Sure.
or a new, something along those lines.
Okay,
I was thinking more of a walk-on motion. I apologize if
Yeah,
that was out of
yeah.
place, which.
Well, I'm thinking maybe if you reestablish the existing ones, clear that motion under number 2, and then
2B, we'll do a second
walk on
one.
a second motion with the adoption of a,
Is that okay? Okay.
So I rescind my motion for the moment.
Thank you. So a motion for reestablishing current standing committees and ad hoc committees.
Move. So move.
Second?
Second.
Thank you. Roll call for that.
Who was the second? I apologize, I don't recognize voices yet. Thank you. Mrs. Blatfield?
Yes.
Mrs. Duggan?
Yes.
Mr. Fowler?
Yes.
Ms. Gong?
Yes.
Mrs. Kellogg?
Yes.
Mrs. O'Donnell?
Yes.
Mrs. Peterson?
Yes.
Mr. Reimer?
Yes.
And Mrs. Santangelo?
Yes.
All yes, motion carries.
Okay. Would we like to have any other motions to establish new committees?
I would like to make a motion to establish a policy committee for the reasons I gave just a moment ago.
Okay. Do we have a second?
Second.
Any discussion?
Who was the second? I apologize, I
Duggan?
can't.
I mean, I would just open it up for discussion. We used to have a policy committee, actually, so it's nothing new. We sort of consolidated from, there was a time where we had like 9 committees, and then we went to 3. We've now added some of these ad hocs. So you can go either way. So we started doing the policies in each of the committees where they fell. I'm just curious your thoughts about why you think that that's not working.
It's not so much the new policies and the updated policies, but we have, part of our responsibility per NJSBA is maintenance of our manual, and our manual is badly out of date in places. We've run into this issue. We ran into it last year with our reorganization meeting. We should be on a regular basis going through and following through. So we tend to lose things through the crack if we don't have a committee focused on doing that. So I think what the committee is going to need to do is it's probably going to be a pretty hefty lifting to go through each section of the policy manual, address what is possibly not even necessary to have anymore, what could be removed, what needs to be addressed, what needs to be changed. Like I've said prior, we have policies on public use of payphones on campus. I don't think we have a payphone anymore, so.
Isn't that what we hire Strauss Esme to be doing, or is this
No,
over and above what?
They do not really go through our personal manual and look at what is out of date and what is not. They really just do policy updates based on changes in the law.
Let me, I do want to interject because they do actually do that. They do that for us once every 2 years. In fact, we're working off of a current audit of our policy manual. And each month we add additional policies to bring them up to date on any that are out of date from prior cycles. So we're in actually very good shape, and I think if a policy committee were to convene, it would find that it doesn't have that much to do in terms of updating policies from Strauss Esme. What you're also finding, however, is that administrative code is not updated in every case, and so your policies are a reflection of administrative code. We see that in the conversations we've had just recently about the organization meeting, which I'll talk a little bit about during my report. So you're free to update those, just know that that would require some input from board council because you'd be going beyond where administrative code has gone. So I would say a majority of the issue is outdated administrative code rather than outdated policy efforts, either from the district or from our policy vendor.
Well, the administrative code is updated every 7 years. Most of our bylaws, for instance, really haven't been updated since 1998. So I think that's where either Strauss Esme has perhaps considered some of them not necessary, or perhaps they figure maybe some schools do have, things like public phones, and but I think this is something that, because it is one of our most important roles as a board, as a policy-making body, we should really have a focused unit looking at that.
Yeah, not agreeing or disagreeing, just wanting to correct the characterization of our policy manual as out of date as it seemed that you were implying, because it is quite up to date with our policy vendors' releases.
I'm sorry, I do have a question. I hope this is following Robert's rules. So as the board, our job is to look at policies. So I'm wondering if you had a committee that only looked at the manual, which is made up of policies, isn't then there overlap or confusion if the board is looking at various policies? So I'm just confused about, so we're here to look at policies, but you have a policy committee. So what would be the difference between the policy committee and then the board looking at a policy?
The way the board generally works is we kind of subgroup the work throughout, and certainly everybody has a voice in the end in the vote of whether to approve or deny something, but the committees themselves, you kind of send, this is the work that's going to go to them. So the policy committee would review and make recommendations to the board as a whole to vote on changes, updates, removals, things like that.
Thank you. So it really wouldn't be duplicate work then?
Correct.
Any other discussion? Seeing none, I'll put to roll call the motion to establish a policy review committee.
Mrs. Bloodfield?
Yes.
Mrs. Duggan?
Yes.
Mr. Fowler?
Yes.
Ms. Gong?
Yes.
Mrs. Kellogg?
Yes.
Mrs. O'Donnell?
No.
Mrs. Peterson?
Yes.
Mr. Reimer? Yes. And Mrs. Santangelo?
Yes.
Majority, motion carries.
All right. And before we jump to the committee appointments and other items, we have received notice, even though it's still coming up later on in our meeting, and Dr. Moore mentioned it at the December meeting, that he intends to move on. So I would like to move a motion to establish an ad hoc superintendent search committee. Would anybody like to support that motion?
Second.
will second.
Thank you. Any discussion? If none, could we have a roll call vote for that, please?
Mrs. Butterfield?
Yes.
Mrs. Duggan?
Yes.
Mr. Fowler?
Yes.
Ms. Gong?
Yes.
Mrs. Kellogg? Mrs. O'Donnell?
Yes.
Mrs. Peterson?
Yes.
Mr. Reimer?
Yes.
And Mrs. Santangelo?
Yes.
All yes, motion carries.
All right, next is appointing committee chairpersons and members. Acknowledging that we have a pretty busy year, I have gone through the effort of putting together some committees, chair people, and members. Would you like me to read that off now? Any concerns with that?
No,
Okay.
no. Yeah, you're probably, that doesn't need voting.
Right.
Yeah.
And if you don't want to write it, Mrs. Spitzer, I have it, and I can email it to you as well. It's up to
Thank
you. All right, in no particular order, so operations and transportation will be chaired by Ms. Duggan and will include Ms. Gong and Mrs. Peterson as members. SLP will be chaired by Mr. Reimer and will include Ms. O'Donnell and Ms. Santangelo as members. Personnel will be chaired by Mrs. Blitfield and will include Mrs. Kellogg and Mrs. Santangelo as members. Our newly formed Policy Review Committee will be chaired by Mrs. Peterson and will include Mrs. Gong and Mrs. Santangelo as members. Our Racism, Equality, and Diversity will be chaired by Mrs. O'Donnell and will include Mrs. Blitfield as a member. Our Communications Committee will be chaired by Mrs. Kellogg and will include Mrs. O'Donnell and Mr. Reimer as members. Our new Superintendent Ad Hoc Committee will be chaired by Mrs. Blitfield and will include Ms. Duggan and Mr. Reimer as members. The new Superintendent Ad Hoc. Yes, Mrs. Kellogg. Is it not?
So it was reapproved under number 2 as it's not listed for committee appointments, but technically we did reapprove it, so he can roster it. But if there's discussion about that, I guess.
Okay. Sure. And then we have the HCAA negotiations ad hoc. Since there is a lot of committees and there's a lot of people chairing it, I've decided that I'll assist by chairing that, and then will be included by Mrs. Peterson and Mrs. Gong. There's the Student Discipline Committee, which will be chaired by Mrs. Kellogg, membered with Mrs. Duggan and myself. And then representatives, we have NJSBA, which,
That's going to need motion.
do you want me to wait for a motion for that? Sure. For the representative appointments?
Yes, that will be,
Okay.
that will need motion.
Sure, not a problem. So those are the committees, I believe, that we have all of the lists. If I've missed any, please let me know and I'll rectify that.
Did he do equity?
He did red, yeah, he did.
Counseling?
Counseling is no longer, they did their policy, so they're good. Okay.
Okay. So next will be a motion to move to approve the following group representatives. So let me make sure I get this right. For NJSBA, how do we name it? I'm sorry, one second, please. The delegate will be Mrs. Blutfeld, and the alternate will be Mrs. Dugan. The Hunterdon County SBA delegate will be Ms. O'Donnell, and the alternate will be Mrs. Peterson. Hunterdon County Educational Services Committee representative, suggestion I guess I should put since it's a motion, is Mrs. Santangelo. Polytech is Mrs. Kellogg, and finally, Hunterdon Central School Foundation liaison is Mrs. Gong. So I'm presenting a motion for those appointments.
Point of, I guess, information.
Yes, please.
There's a District Evaluation Advisory Committee on the agenda. Is that,
We need a move in a second, please, before discussion. To put the motion, did we do a move in a second to put? the
I didn't know
motion?
if it was a complete motion yet, because there's something on the agenda that
So
Yeah.
we'll move it the way it's been stated, and then I think I can clarify for you. Is there a second?
Second.
Who was the move, please?
Can I move it?
Move it.
Yeah. All right,
Now
discussion.
Really just a point of information, there is a district evaluation advisory committee on the agenda, and I just didn't hear anything that read off. Is that something I don't even recall having anyone assigned to that last year.
I'd asked the exact same question, and I believe
So
Dr.
the
Moore would have an answer?
District Evaluation Advisory Committee is no longer required by the state. It was sunset as a requirement in 2017-18, I believe, is the last year that was required. Some districts continue to operate it. We continued to operate it for several years as we revised our teacher evaluation system. But it hasn't been active this year, and I don't foresee a need for it moving forward unless my successor would like to ramp that back up for any purpose.
Okay. Any other comments or questions? Hearing none, can I have a roll call vote, please?
Mrs. Bledfield?
Yes?
Mrs. Duggan?
Yes.
Mr. Fowler?
Yes?
Ms. Gong?
Yes.
Mrs. Kellogg? Yes. Mrs. O'Donnell?
Yes.
Mrs. Peterson?
Yes.
Mr. Reimer?
Yes.
And Mrs. Santangelo?
Yes.
All yes, motion carries.
Thank you, Mrs. Spitzer. And our final organizational item for tonight, as I see it, is a motion to revise the school calendar for 2023-2024 to add an emergency school closing number 1 on December 18th of 2023. Anybody like to move that?
So moved.
Any discussion?
Only that we do this periodically whenever we have an emergency closure, so this was our emergency closure for rain, that terrible rainstorm that we had that was flooding throughout the region that woke us all up by surprise that morning. Now, that leaves us with one more emergency closing day for the year. We continue to wait for the state to weigh in on whether virtual days would be allowed under certain circumstances, but in any event, we do have contingency plans listed there if we go beyond our 2 days. And you can continue to read the little fine print at the bottom to see how we would begin to draw on holidays and other days off if we needed additional days. The state requires 180 days for students, and there's no flexibility on that. So we have to put in 180 days. And the last thing you ever want to do in a high school district is change the graduation date. Right, Mr. Brandt? You don't ever want to change the graduation date, right? So we try to make up those days through the calendar if we need them. So what's changing here is because of the emergency day on the 18th, we have an early dismissal that was on the 29th, which is now being moved to the 30th. And we have first day of semester 2, which is being moved from the 30th to the 31st.
Thank you, Dr. Moore. No other questions or comments about that? Can we have a roll call, please?
Mrs. Bledfield?
Yes.
Mrs. Duggan?
Yes.
Mr. Fowler?
Yes.
Ms. Gong?
Yes.
Mrs. Kellogg? Mrs. O'Donnell?
Yes.
Mrs. Peterson?
Yes.
Mr. Reimer? Mrs. Santangelo?
Yes.
All yes, motion carries.
Thank you. Dr. Moore.
Thank you. Happy New Year again to everybody. Welcome and congratulations to Ms. Santangelo, and there's Ms. Gong right next to you there. Just so you all know, and I've been in touch a little, and I know Mrs. Spitzer's office has been in touch with our 2 new members to get them ramped up on all the requirements now. The next step for them will be a marathon half day with our administrators where you'll receive a lot of different information about different projects and topics, and some of that information is privileged, so it has to wait until you were sworn in. But we'll try to schedule that before the end of January with you. And if we can get you both on the same day, that's best for our operations, so we'll try to arrange that. So Mrs. Graham and my office will be in touch to start trying to arrange that both with you and all of our administrators. I'll be involved in that as well. And the promise will always be to continue with all of you, of course. The promise is always to continue to interact or meet or discuss any questions that you have on anything. And as you move forward, our new members certainly lots of experience at this table as you move into your committees who can mentor you as well. But the first year does take a little while get the swing of things. So don't feel self-conscious about it if you're still getting your feet under you next month. I have to unfortunately follow those sentiments with just a notification that we have today been tracking news out of Perry, Iowa, of a school shooting in a high school. And I mention that only because that does have impacts at our school, especially when that happens in a high school. And so teachers, students, folks are tracking that news throughout the day, so we try to keep an extra close eye on everybody. It also affects the way that we take care of one another as adults and look out for one another as adults. So I've asked everybody at school today to offer some thoughts and prayers for our students, their families, our colleagues at that high school in Iowa, and just ask for you all to spare the same when you have a moment as that situation develops. In those kinds of situations, we're always extremely grateful for law enforcement, and here's another situation which law enforcement played a decisive role in saving lives from what we're seeing in the news reports. And it always leads me to want to express admiration and gratitude for our partners with the Raritan Township Police Department, who have on any given day up to 4 officers posted throughout our campus between our 3 Class 3s and our full-time SRO. So we are very fortunate in the partnership that we have with those experts and their loyalty to and just expertise, their loyalty to the school and the expertise that they offer us. Now, there have been, I have a few items to discuss because we have a few action items on the agenda, and we're always very self-conscious about that when we have action items on the reorg agenda, because it's an agenda we try to avoid those sorts of things as much as possible. The calendar adjustment is an easy thing to talk about. We need to change the calendar because we need to publicize that to the community. It affects the scheduling of an early dismissal, so we need ample time to communicate that. So we put that on the agenda. There are 2 other items, though, in addition to the board's acceptance of my retirement, which is there tonight to give you the most flexibility that you can have in accepting that and moving forward on any next steps that you need to take. But there are 2 other items. There's a personnel appointment there, which is the appointment of a substitute administrator. That is Mrs. Barbara Manfredi. Barbara Manfredi is a retired administrator. She spent many years here at Central. And we have a building administrator now who's going to be out on some potentially extended sick leave. And so we're asking you to approve Mrs. Manfredi to pitch in, come out of retirement for a couple of days each week maybe, and help move all of those duties forward. Now, the board did the exact same thing in October of '22 under a very similar situation, and Ms. Manfredi came back into the building then as well and was able to have a decisive impact. I know Mr. Brandt will attest a decisive impact on making sure everything moved forward. So it's on the agenda tonight, not just because I'm excited to see Mrs. Manfredi again, but also because we need her immediately. And to wait until the 22nd will create a backlog of concerns and situations for our students and our staff that I couldn't bear, so I needed to bring that to you tonight. The other item on there is through an addendum to our Operations and Transportation Committee. And we had a lot of conversation about this through email, and I have to apologize for the volume of emails that went out about various things as we came into this week. That's not uncommon for the reorg agenda as we answer different questions, especially with new members, but this is not a common motion in our addendum. Ms. Alicia Dinella serves as board counsel through the Parker McKay Law Firm. Ms. Dinella is leaving that firm to become a founding partner with a new firm. And we have the opportunity to appoint her for, on a stretch into June here that will allow us to maintain continuity in all of the issues in which she represents the board. And just so you're aware, my staff, myself, Ms. Spitzer, we're in touch with board council on a regular basis. And if you put us all together, it's probably close to daily, if not sometimes more, depending on what's going on. And board council is involved in many things that you don't see as a board when we need things redacted for HIB hearings, for example, or OPA requests, we need assistance. So to lose board council and have to ramp up new council is not only a larger investment in time and potentially money in terms of hourly fees, but it also, quite frankly, puts the board at risk. You don't take a key chess piece off the board and replace it with a lesser one and say, well, that'll be okay for a few moves. You want that piece there the whole game. And so that's sort of how we think about this. If we lose access to board council, even for a few weeks, then the board is potentially at risk and compromised in situations in which it requires that representation. The other piece of this that I'm actually pleased to share with you, which I shared an email with you all, is our current hourly rate for Parker McKay is $215 an hour. Ms. Dinella will charge us $175 an hour, so it's a savings of money as well. So it's risk avoidance. It is savings in time that would be spent otherwise on ramping up unfamiliar counsel, and it is just a flat-out cost savings as well. Now, I would encourage the boards to, at some point in the spring, consider a request for proposals process to secure counsel on a more permanent basis. You would be approving Ms. Dinella's firm here tonight through June 30th, and I would recommend you to go through the process, the more comprehensive process of finding more permanent counsel now that she's left that firm of Parker McKay. Lastly, I do also want to share just another conversation that went on, and it's a bit technical, but I want to make sure everybody hears it. Again, the volume of email over the past couple of days was a little daunting, so I just want to make sure everybody gets all of the bullet points on everything. Your policies your bylaws rather, talk about an organization meeting. They also talk about an organizational meeting, depending on which bylaw you're looking at. Colloquially out there, it's known as the reorg meeting or the reorganization meeting or the reorganizational meeting. This all made sense back when elections were in April for school boards. So budget elections, school board elections occurred in April. New board members would sign on at a subsequent later meeting, and the board would reorganize in May, and then would also reorganize the district to implement the budget that had just been approved. So it all happened in May, and it all made sense. So there's a list of dozens of things. We've only done a very small handful of them. There's a list of dozens of things that need to be approved on an annual basis, and those used to be done all at once after the election with an approved budget. When the board elections moved to November 2012-ish, none of those other processes like budgeting or anything went with them. So budgeting still occurs out in the spring. Lots of other things in terms of preparing for the next school year occur out in the spring, but we seat you now as a new board in January. It would be presumptuous of me to put some of those items in front of you tonight before you have an approved budget. Curriculum's a good example. If I put curriculum before you tonight, I would be feeling like I have to put it before you again in May after you approve the budget. And on top of that, it's unnecessary because last year when all those items were approved, they were approved through June 30 of this year. So we have the cycle going. Districts do it both ways. Some districts will do it all in January. Other districts will do it in 2 meetings or even staggered over a longer period of time. I believe that's more proper. And so, moving forward, however you all want to do it, certainly is fine. But I was very pleased when I arrived here in 2017 and saw that the district was doing it that way, because it meant that we weren't asking you to approve and reauthorize things that were budget dependent before you even had a budget approved. So if you go into code, if you go into not sure about where statute is on this, but if you go into our policies, you'll find there's still a bit of a mess there. But we've never been cited in any audit finding. We've never had a CUSAC deduction. We've never had any issues doing it the way we do it. And if we ever were to, and I can't imagine we would, but if we ever were to have some sort of accountability issue, I think you have a pretty good argument to make that, well, I don't want to approve curriculum yet because we don't have a budget yet. And that would be unwise to approve curriculum before we have our budget. So I just wanted to fill in a little bit of information about that, just so that you all had a sense of all the highlights of the correspondence that's been going on over the past couple of days as we ramped up for this meeting. And with that, Mr. Fowler, I am all done. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Moore. At this time, we'll open up our meeting to the first of two public comment sections. This section is only for action items on tonight's agenda. So if anybody would like to make a comment on tonight's agenda action items, please feel free to come to the microphone and we'll give you 5 minutes. Seeing none, we'll continue on to Operations and Transportation Committee. So uniquely, I chaired Operations and Transportation last year, and one of the items is JTC Committee update. I'd like to update the board that after our December 20th meeting, communications and emails continued on between myself, Dr. Moore, Dr. McGann, and other members of the JTC from Flemington Raritan. And we've gotten some direction from our county superintendent. I guess at that point in time, I'll hand it over to Dr. Moore to drill into the detail around that letter that we received and some of the implications and considerations this board's probably going to have to consider in very short order. Dr. Moore?
Yes, thank you.
You're welcome.
And we've had some conversation about this in committees here at this table, and I, for one, am just quite frankly very frustrated with the whole situation. And I know I'm not the only one. I'm not the one who deals with the implications of it all day, every day, in the way that our transportation folks do, in the way that our drivers do, in the way that Mrs. Spitzer does. It's an incredibly frustrating situation. And it's not about, there's a dispute over transportation for the universal pre-K expansion, preschool expansion students at Flemington Raritan. And this by no means is a complaint about universal pre-K. We benefit from that as a high school. I'm very grateful for the support that the state is giving to that program throughout our region, throughout our county, among my colleagues, both in our sending regions and across the whole county and across the state. Universal pre-K helps us in the high school, to be sure. So I am very grateful for that. What I'm concerned about is the impact on this board as a co-owner of the joint transportation operation with Flemington Raritan. Concerned about the impact of this board and on the drivers and the staff who do this expert work every day, of compromising long-standing, well-understood, and frequently validated safety protocols. And in particular, I'm talking about a long-standing rule that the JTC, which is the Joint Transportation Commission with the Flemington Raritan School District, the JTC has always limited the number of children in car seats on buses to 5, with an aide. Now, I understand all of the financial implications of expanding preschool to include more children. I understand all the political implications of that as well, that the governor has put a lot of support behind this expansion, and the citizens of our community want this expansion for their children. However, we've taken issue with the planning and communication around this project. We have not been, our transportation department has not been in a position with the information that it's needed to effectively assist Flemington Raritan in the expansion of its preschool in the way that they've asked for it to be expanded. They insist that we put 10 students in car seats on each bus. 5 versus 10, it doesn't sound like it means a lot. but we're talking about, these 29 passenger vans. And I want you to think about a 29 passenger van taking a 30-minute route with 5, 3, and 4-year-olds in car seats, plus some additional elementary school students, 30 minutes to, say, Copper Hill Elementary School with one aide. On most days, hopefully every day, that's absolutely fine. Now add 5 more students in car seats, no additional aides. Now we have 10 students in car seats, additional elementary school students, 1 aide, 1 driver. Again, knock on wood, that goes fine every day, hopefully. But the day that it doesn't is catastrophic. It takes a bus, and I'm talking about a big 54-passenger bus, not a 29-passenger van. A big 54-passenger bus fills with smoke to the degree that it impedes evacuation in 30 seconds. In 3 minutes, it's engulfed, and the interior of that bus is reaching 1,000 degrees Fahrenheit. Even fire retardant materials are beginning to burn. And at that point, too, what you have to recognize is that fire retardant materials are not even rated for collision, so they're not even used in the construction of buses all that often. So you have now a van, 29 seats, 10 students in car seats, 1 aide, 1 driver who's paying attention to the road on a route that may be 50 minutes long between its start to its delivery at a place like Copper Hill. We have, over the past several months, and I would even say over the past several years, resisted requests to increase from 5 to 10 students because we're concerned about that scenario. We're concerned about 10 students in car seats who have to be assisted on and off in the event of an emergency in which 30 seconds means life or death for the people on the bus. So we have resisted that. We have at every turn offered alternative solutions, contracting with other vendors. We have spent an inordinate amount of time running routes to see what we could accommodate. We delivered routes to Flemington Raritan a few weeks ago, keyed to 5 per bus. And we have bent over backwards on more occasions than I can even count at this point to try and make this work. Throughout the whole thing, we have pleaded with our colleagues over there to look for other options, look for alternatives, think about, plan for different contingencies here. They told us they were, but I'm not sure that that's happened. Now, again, I understand the financial implications of not wanting to spend money on more routes, despite the award of $1.2 million in grant money, wanting to keep the transportation costs neutral. I understand the pressures of that. I understand the political pressures again, but I don't understand why we would cut safety corners to achieve either of those priorities. Proper planning, I would think, allows you to achieve priorities while still keeping your eye on what is the most important priority in a situation like this, which is student safety. Now, Flemington Raritan, after lots of conversation over the past several months about this, sought a directive from the executive county superintendent to overturn our safety protocols. And the executive county superintendent has delivered a letter to this board, to the JTC really, ordering that we place 10 students with 1 aide on each bus. And that it would, it's not under anyone's authority to listen to experts who say that ought to be less. So that's the situation we're in now. We have a directive to lower our safety standards. And again, that will be fine until it's not. And this board After resisting that, after making strong arguments, after talking again and again about not just the safety, but also the logistical issues of that, what happens when you make a 30-minute route 50 minutes? It throws off some things. You know, what happens with adding 5 additional car seats to a bus that also has to transport middle school students later on in the day? You know, what happens to the driver's responsibility now? You know, the driver has much more responsibility to ensure the safety, and they certainly don't want to cut any corners. So we're very frustrated with this, and I think the board has some decisions to make, not just about the preschool expansion and the order that we've been given, but also just about the future of the jointure in general. So that's our update on it for tonight. I can take additional questions, but we also have some closed session conversation to have about some options for us on next step here as well. So some questions I might have to refer to closed session.
I just have a question in general. Do we have a contract with the I mean, what is, and maybe this is a closed session question, but is there a contract, an originating contract that started do we have access to that tonight?
Yes, I could give that to you tonight. Yeah. It's a contract from 1995. There are also bylaws. All of this was very successful for decades. But in recent years, and we'll talk more about some of this in recent years, we've had several important disagreements, and this one, though, I have to characterize as the sharpest and most, the largest that I've seen in my time here, unfortunately.
Any other questions, comments?
A question? So what happens if we say to their directive, we can't follow your directive, it's just not within our moral value system because of safety?
We do have options. We do have options to answer this, and we'll talk about those because they involve legal routes for us. One thing, and I thank you, one thing that I want to mention, the state does not have any rule, believe it or not. The state has no rule on how many students you can put on a bus. In car seats. How many 3- and 4-year-olds you can put on a bus in car seats. Has no rule. So Mr. Juan Torres, our executive county superintendent, has given us a directive that I'm concerned has no more validity and I would argue less validity than what the experts in our transportation have determined is safe. The other piece there, though, is that the state has regulated every other aspect of preschool that you could possibly imagine. The preschool classroom is limited to 15 students with 1 aide and 1 teacher who are focused every second on those 15 students. So I want you to think of a classroom with 15 students in it and 2 adults who are constantly focused on them. And I want you to compare that now to a 29-passenger van in which there are 10 students restrained in car seats and additional elementary students, so you could have up to 18 students on some of those buses, 19 students. Realize that every time you put a car seat on, it takes away capacity for seats because car seats take multiple seats. And you have a driver and an aide. The driver is driving. So now you have 1 adult who is really taking care of all of those youngsters in their car seats. When in the classroom, you need 15 with 2. Here we are, 10 to 18 with just 1 person who's really there able to take care of them, hurtling down the road on a route that could be as long as 50 minutes restrained in car seats. So this is just not an acceptable solution that we see here to just shoehorn more students into the buses. What is that? Yeah, so in the numbers of aides, yeah. Well, it's 50, it's limited to 15.
But any more than 8.
Any more than 8 requires an aide? Yeah. Yeah. So there's a lot for us to talk about here. There's no action I'm asking for you right now, although, we'll talk about some potential action in closed session. And I just need you to know the situation. Again, this is not a complaint against Universal Pre-K. It's not a complaint really against any of my colleagues at Flemington Raritan. It's just really woe over a situation that has become a dispute through what we're reading as maybe negligence in planning, unfortunately. And again, we've tried to bend over backwards. Right now, our transportation department is working to see what it looks like to put 10 students on each of these vehicles, and you can imagine, they're running into all kinds of obstacles. And we still don't have enough seats on the buses for all of the students. Yeah. That could lead us to considering large 54-passenger buses for our preschool students, which is a daunting thing to consider, and again, raises all of its own logistical questions, because many of our vans already have some number of car seats built in. So there's a lot to consider here. It's a very complicated situation, but we are extremely frustrated by it, unfortunately, and so we'll talk more about it later this evening. Other questions?
I was just thinking, I wonder if Flemmer would consider putting additional aides on the bus, at least to keep the 1-to-5 ratio, if that becomes a ruling that we have to deal with.
So the ruling we received indicates 1. And even additional aides doesn't solve all of your logistical problems of putting more students on those buses. And again, I want you to imagine 3- and 4-year-olds in car seats on a 50-minute bus ride. There aren't enough adults to put in that. And I can't imagine. I don't know. I don't want to editorialize on it any further. I think I've done a bit too much of that already. But it's a terribly striking and frustrating situation, and for us, it comes down to just being mystified at why the safety concern is not front and center and not being understood. There's some more details probably than we even talked about giving on this tonight, but there it is.
Okay, so with that, we'll move to the next agenda item for O&T, which is under our addendums, and it is the aforementioned motion to approve a resolution to accept Ms. Danella and her new law firm as attorneys at a rate of $175 an hour from tomorrow through June 30th of 2024.
So moved.
Thank you. Second?
Second.
Okay. Anybody have any discussion?
I would just like to add a couple of comments to what Dr. Moore had to say. Not only has Ms. Daniela been the main point of contact for the past couple of years with Parker McKay, she worked with Comegno Law Group before that. And I believe it was a couple of years there as well where she was pretty much the lead person. So not only has she been committed, dependable, available, she has the expertise, but she also knows our district really well. She's been with us a long time.
I have a few questions just in general about, I wasn't able to find anything on the new law firm online, what the malpractice insurance coverage they have, what the, what their staff looks like, what happens to, like, cases that are currently with Parker McKay. Does that switch everything? I mean, there's a lot of questions involved in kind of a big shift like this. So hopefully we get an opportunity to get some of those answered.
Yeah, I can share on one of those items that, Ms. Danella, working with her colleagues there at Parker McKay, she'd be taking our cases with her, is my understanding. Now, we have cases with other law firms and with insurance-assigned attorneys that wouldn't be impacted by this. But a lot of day-to-day and also some specific cases that you're all aware of are in her hands. I don't have answers, unfortunately, to your questions about insurance or staffing. I know this has just been cleared as an LLC, if that's even the right terminology for it. But she is ready and able to go. As soon as that switch is made, we would be able to utilize her at her new firm. She is still with Parker McKay for the immediate time being, so it's not as if tomorrow we'd be switching out of Parker McKay. That's still unknown at this point. You know, that's up to the continued work that she has with her law firm.
So would be essentially firing Parker McKay, I guess?
No, Parker McKay would still be approved as a law firm. You aren't rescinding approval for Parker McKay.
But even any cases that she doesn't handle, that Parker McKay is handling, she's going to take?
We don't have anything other
Yeah.
than construction law with them. They're our construction attorney as well.
Yes.
So we use them for different reasons.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know how many law firms, but we have several law firms that we had approved, and we don't have to use them. We can do the approval, and she's just there to be used. If we start using her and we don't like what we see, we've done this before, where we have multiple law firms, we can switch. It just gives us the flexibility. So nothing says that, oh, you're approved, now we have to give you business. And nothing says that because, if we move things away from Parker McKay, that we have to say, well, we're using them anyway for construction. But even if we weren't, nothing says that, we have to now take their name off because now we're moving cases away. But
And has anybody contacted Parker McKay to see if they wanted to match the rate or what their input was on this?
I can't answer that.
I mean,
but-
we have a current contract with Parker McKay for this rate. That's a standard rate that they offer. We haven't had conversations about matching that rate. But quite honestly, my recommendation tonight includes the endorsement of her continued representation of you. I frankly don't want you to vote this down or to table this. If you do, as I said earlier, it will put us at risk. It will put you at risk, and it will cost you more money in the time it would take, just in terms of productivity of me and my staff, hours and hours on the phone ramping up a new attorney. So we have ongoing active issues, and we also have daily needs as a big organization for legal counsel. This would be tremendously disruptive for you to take a different path here. I can't be clearer about it than that. I wouldn't be making the recommendation to you tonight on this agenda if I didn't feel it was important. I'd wait
And
until the
correct me if
22nd.
I'm wrong, because I don't think I was here when she moved over to Parker McKay, but I think she probably brought things over with her
Yes.
from Comegno, so it's a similar type of thing, except that this is, she's starting a law firm. But again, it's been her expertise that, and I can tell you, because I had worked with her for years, and she is phenomenal.
Mm-hmm.
She's really one of the most knowledgeable attorneys in school law, and she's very available and committed to our district, which you don't always find.
Mm-hmm.
So if I could just jump in and make a comment or two. I want to recognize that, Ms. Dianella has certainly been around a lot of our litigation as of late. Her name is involved in a lot of things, and so I can respect that it would put some risk around our operations if she was not available to us. At the same time, I do want to recognize that this just came up in the last couple of days, hasn't really had time to vet it through a lot of conversation, answer some of the questions that we may have outstanding, and make sure that our new members are fully up to speed on this. So I think actually to prevent the chance that this wouldn't pass, I'd like to propose a motion to postpone this vote definitely to at least, or at most, January 22nd, if not sooner, because we will have an executive session tonight, which we can talk about legal matters, and I believe there's a potential for us to come back and make motions afterwards. So if it fits and if we can get everything addressed, maybe we can still get a vote in today. but allow time for us in closed session to address some of the legal ramifications and concerns that might need to be talked about. So I'll make that motion if there's a second.
So to postpone, it's not tabling, it's postponing. the vote.
Postponing,
Until after executive session?
Yeah.
correct.
question?
Yeah.
Or the next meeting, indefinite or table or indefinite.
Definitely. yeah.
Table or indefinite?
Second for postponing till after executive session.
Okay. Any discussion around that?
I-
Yes.
I was just going to clarify, so then I guess if after executive session we haven't come up with a decision, then we come out and we make a motion to postpone definite to the 22nd? Is that kind of the idea, or, because I'm kind of confused on where we're at with which motion?
Yeah, so currently what the motion is out today, right now, is to postpone it definitely, not indefinitely, definitely until after our closed session, right? And then at that point in time, we go to vote. And I believe there's a second. Any other questions or conversations around that?
I'm just concerned about the vulnerability of the board with any lack of continuity with really just a stellar attorney who has, really done incredible work for us for so many years. And the last couple of years with the excessive litigation that she's handled for us, I would be very concerned about swapping that out to someone else. I think in HR, one of the most important things is retaining good people. So that's my concern.
Understood?
So just to clarify, Dr. Moore, did you say that we could still use her through Parker McKay for a period of time? Or what?
Yeah, her departure date from there is not certain as of yet.
Okay.
Yes. It could happen at any moment, or it could happen after January 22nd.
Okay, but she's still employed.
She's still there now, yes.
Okay, that's helpful, thank you.
I have a question. So, are you saying that there'll be more information in closed session?
That's
That
what,
we've not
that's what this
discussed
current
here.
motion opens us up to, is the ability to talk about this and some of the detailed legal matters that we might not be able to share in public in closed session. Make sure that we can deliberate this appropriately with that information, and then come back to a fully informed vote tonight.
Thank you.
Yes. So the current motion is to postpone this definitely until after closed session.
So we're going to come back
And then have a motion to vote for it. Okay, so any other questions or discussions around this?
So the goal of executive session on this matter is to reach a decision and come out and make a vote, not to decide to delay the vote.
To answer the questions that could be outstanding so that we can make a vote in public afterwards. Hearing no other questions, can we have a roll call on, again, just to clarify, the motion to postpone this current vote on the table until after closed session?
Mr. Fowler, do we have a second?
We did, yes. Can I have a roll call vote, please?
Mrs. Butterfield?
Yes.
Mrs. Duggan?
Yes.
Mr. Fowler?
Yes.
Ms. Gong?
Yes.
Mrs. Kellogg? Yes. Mrs. O'Donnell?
Yes.
Mrs. Peterson?
Yes.
Mr. Reimer? Yes. And Mrs. Santangelo?
Yes.
All yes, motion carries.
Thank you, everybody. Give me 1 second. Back to our agenda. Yes, all right. So now we are going to move into personnel.
And-
Mrs. Butterfield, would you like to take the personnel items, or would you like me to work through them?
Sure. I mean, there was no meeting, but as Dr. Moore said, we have our one per diem for Ms. Manfredi. And then we unfortunately have the retirement of Dr. Moore. And I, for one, am very sad to see you go. I think it's shared by a majority here in the community. Dr. Moore has been with us now for almost 7 years. And to say that those 7 years were challenging, I think, is a bit of an understatement. But despite all the challenges, I truly believe that Central is in a much better place than it was 7 years ago. So thank you for your commitment to the district, and thank you for all your contributions, and best of luck. So I sadly will move personnel items 1 and 2.
Thank you for the motion. Second? Second. Any questions, comments, discussion?
Just a comment. I would just emphasize what Ms. Blutfield said, that I'm sad to not have the opportunity to work with Dr. Moore beyond March 31st.
Thank you. I will also echo these sentiments. Even though we've only worked together for 2.5 years, one has to respect navigating the unknown of COVID and all that carried with it. And I don't think it would put you down to say all the gray hairs that you gained as a result of it. I didn't see them, don't worry. But yes, thank you. Thank you for your dedication to this institution. With that, I'll open it up to a roll call vote.
Mrs. Blutfield?
Yes.
Mrs. Duggan?
Yes.
Mr. Fowler?
Yes.
Ms. Gong?
Yes.
Mrs. Kellogg? Yes. Mrs. O'Donnell?
Yes.
Mrs. Peterson?
Yes.
Mr. Reimer? Yes. And Ms. Santangelo?
Yes.
Oh, yes, motion carries.
Thank
We
you.
have to do a second public meeting, isn't on here?
There isn't a second public comment?
Nope.
There is, under M.
Yeah.
Yep, but first, additional business. Any other additional business on committees from our board? I will certainly take a second to welcome Ms. Santangelo and Ms. Gong to the board again. Congratulations on your appointment to our board. Looking forward to, and had some more wonderful conversations and exchanges already, but looking forward to many, 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 many more over the course of the next year. So welcome. Seeing nothing else, we'll go to our second residence forum for the night. So if anybody would like to come up to the podium and make any comments, please feel free. We'll open it up for 5 minutes per commenter. If you could just write down your name and then state your name and township of residence, please, before you speak.
Hi, my name is Victor Sloan. I have 2 disclosures. I live in Raritan Township. That's not my disclosure. My first disclosure is that I've been very lucky to be married to Sandra Gong for 35 years, as this past October. My second disclosure is that these comments are my own, and they do not necessarily reflect the opinion of the United States government, the Peace Corps, or the Department of Homeland Security. It's no secret that school boards across the country and school board meetings have been increasingly polarized. And I've seen some of the comments here at the meetings in Hunterdon and have been saddened and really horrified at some of the vitriol and hatred that's been expressed. But I'm sure that all of you on the board and all of us who are parents all want the same thing for our children. We want them to be happy, healthy, successful, and safe. More than 200 years ago, on receiving a letter of congratulations on his election from the Hebrew congregation of Newport, George Washington responded in part, "For happily the government of the United States gives to bigotry no sanction, and to persecution no assistance. Requires only that they who live under its protection should demean themselves as good citizens, in giving it on all occasions their effectual support." In thinking about what I wanted to say tonight, I found this comment from Wendy Jacobson, who's a therapist and a parent. She wrote that we can heal division without being unified in all of our beliefs. There are certain things people will never agree upon, and that's okay. Healthy discourse and debate are part of democracy. We can still cultivate understanding, acknowledge both the heroes and the horrors of our history, and build a better society together. I would ask that all of you consider these wise words as you deliberate. Thank you.
Thank you. Seeing nobody else coming, I will close the second residents forum and open up for any board comments for this evening. Any member comments?
I would just like to welcome our two new members and re-welcome Ms. Kellogg. Re-welcome. That's an interesting term, a phrase. Welcome back, and looking forward to a productive year for us, which is going to, I think, be busy.
Yeah, ditto. Welcome to Ms. Gong and Mrs. Santangelo. Congratulations, and good to have you back, Dee.
Yep, I'd like to say welcome as well to you both, and Dee for another 3 years. And we definitely are going to have a busy year ahead of us. So looking forward to having a good collaborative board here to get a lot of stuff done.
I'll cap it off by, again, welcoming the new board members, welcoming back Mrs. Kellogg. You're such a staple here that I didn't even think about it when I welcomed the two earlier. Just used to having you at the table, so I'm glad to have you back at the table. Again, thank you, everybody, for your support of having me as president this year. As I've already proven, because it's my first time, I will not be infallible. I will be making mistakes, but hopefully I reduce them month over month. And finally, I'll reinforce something I think I said to Dr. Moore the first time I met him, which is, as a graduate of Central, class of 95, I will do whatever I can to help the school out, including taking on the role of president if and as necessary, and hopefully navigating us through a very, very busy year, as we have many things to do. And looking forward to working with all of you over and over again to make sure that this institution receives the attention it needs from us. With that, we will convene into executive session. We will have a number of things to discuss, and we will be coming back with action items afterwards.
Motion, please.
Can I have a motion to convene?
Second.
Second, so moved.
And you don't need a roll call, right? All in favor?
Aye.
Aye. Any abstentions? Any noes? Thank you. See you after closed session.
I need to give this to Ed. to.
We need a motion to restart the meeting, right?
We did. We're motion to reconvene. We're in.
We're in.
We are?
We're in.
Good to go? All right. So we have two motions. I'll read the first, and then I believe Dr. Moore will read the second. So the first motion after deliberation is to approve a resolution to grant a professional services contract to Gorman, Dianella, and Morlock LLC at a rate of $175 per hour from January 5th, 2024 through June 30th of 2024. Can I have a motion to move it?
So moved.
Second.
All right, any discussion further? Hearing none, can I have a roll call, please?
Mrs. Bluttfield?
Yes.
Mrs. Duggan?
Yes.
Mr. Fowler?
Yes.
Ms. Gong?
Yes.
Mrs. Kellogg?
Yes.
Mrs. O'Donnell?
Yes.
Mrs. Peterson?
Abstain?
Mr. Reimer?
Yes.
And Ms. Santangelo?
Yes.
Motion carries.
Thank you. And then we are going to have a second motion.
Yes. So this would be in, what would you say, O&T?
O&T.
Correct.
Okay. So move to authorize the Board of Education President to appeal to the New Jersey Department of Education Office of Controversies and Disputes the December 29th, 2023 written decision of Executive County Superintendent Juan Torres mandating the relaxation of transportation safety protocols for preschool riders.
Second.
Okay, any discussion? Roll call, please.
Mrs. Bluttfield?
Yes.
Mrs. Duggan?
Yes.
Mr. Fowler?
Yes.
Ms. Gong?
Yes.
Mrs. Kellogg?
Yes.
Mrs. O'Donnell?
Yes.
Mrs. Peterson?
Yes.
Mr. Reimer?
Yes.
And Mrs. Santangelo?
Yes.
All yes, motion carries.
Thank you. And finally, motion to adjourn?
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
Any noes? Any abstentions? Have a good evening, everybody. Thank you.
Thank you, gentlemen.